Good evening, and sorry for the slight delay. We just had a special session of tefillas in memory of the 45 tragic losses from Lag Boimer in Miran, and for refuah for those who need a refuah shleima. I think you can. I'd like you to join me in saying Kapitel Chof, and then we'll start the shir. Kapitel Chof, then put in tzedakah, and then we'll start the shir. Nanaseach mizberu David Yan, Cho Adonai b'yom tzara Yisagev, Cho Shem Elohei Yaakov, Yishlach Ezracha mikodesh umitzion Yisadecha, Yizker kol min chaysecha v'losecha Yidach Neselo, Yitem lecha chilvavecha v'atzoscha Yimale, Neranan Abishuosecha v'Shem Eloheinu Nidger Yimale, Adonai kol mishalesecha, Ata Yodati ki Hishi Adonai Meshichai, Yaneu Mishmei Kodshei b'Gvures Yeshi Yeminoi, Eile vorechev veile vasusim anachnu b'shem Adonai Eloheinu nazkir. Hey mokaru v'nofolu v'anachnu kamnu v'anis eidod. Adonai hishi hamelech yaneinu yem kodeinu. Okay. Okay. Right. Let's go on to our shir. And so this is a couple of points came up from last week's shir. Talked about rounding off the corner of the blankets, and how there was this little story from the Rebbe Rashab, how when he had a haircut, he would tear off the corner of the sheet, that he shouldn't have a problem of tzitzis. So the person who originally asked the question asked for more details about this, exactly how strong the curve has to be in order to exempt from tzitzis. So just for the Eniklach like to see pictures. So there you have a picture. Now this is taking a square blanket and rounded off a corner that certainly is well beyond the shear. Certainly that would be adequate to make it called a round garment, a round corner, sorry. But let's come back to a bit more technical detail. And this is from the Sefer from Reb Naftali Reb Yechanan Gerari, sorry. Reb Yechanan Gerari put out a Sefer of one of many called Tzitzis Halacha L'Maaseh. And we have here a shear of a beged, which is 3 by 3 etzbois, 3 by 3 finger breadth. And so the idea here is that if the curve is smaller than 6 centimeters, and etzba is 2 centimeters, so 3 etzbois is 6 centimeters. So if you look at the diagrams, so diagram number 1 is saying that because the curve is less than the 6 centimeters from the corner, therefore that would still be called a square. And then if the curve is, as you see, diagram number 3, or number 2 for that matter, if the curve is kind of stretching beyond 6 centimeters, that would be curve enough to exempt the garment from tzitzis. Are those poskim who say even a much smaller curve is enough, but this is the general. What I advise the person is to take a CD, if they still exist, from an antique shop, take a CD and put it at the corner and use that as a template, and that would be kind of the shear that, if it's that degree of curve, it's considered rounded corner. Now, one of our listeners who listens to the recording, Meir Zirkin, and I've mentioned his name before. So he picked up on the story where I had told over about the Rebbe Rashab with the hair cutting. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says he would sometimes give his father a haircut. So he says it's a very interesting point, because there is discussion in poskim whether it's appropriate for a son to give his father a haircut. So now the first quote that you have on the top of the page is from a sefer called Moshav Zkenim, which is from the Rishonim, and it's in Parshas Kedoshim, and it has there a lashon v'lochein asur leven l'saper le'oviv. It's forbidden for a son to give his father a haircut. Shema yiftza oisa, in case he would cause him a wound. The fact that the father is forgiving, that doesn't take away from the avera of causing a wound to a parent, to a father or mother. So we see already in Rishonim there is a hesitation about giving a haircut to a parent. Now, having said that, when we look in, I have one of these encyclopedias on Kibbud Av V'Eim. It's a sefer Oitz Kibbud Av V'Eim. This is the second quote. Very good sefer. And he writes that you are allowed to give a father a haircut, and you don't have to worry about causing a wound. And basically, it seems to be, it depends what you're using. In 600-700 years ago, the likelihood was that they would be using a razor, and therefore using a razor, a slight mistake can cause a cut, and that would be an avera. Whereas if you're using a clippers, even though they didn't use electric clippers 100 years ago, but it could have been a hand clippers. If it's a kind of a safe instrument, then they wouldn't need to hesitate about giving a father a haircut. The Reb Meir, I'm really, I think the word in English is chuffed. Someone like a Talmud Chacham like him is giving the time to listen to the shiur, and you'll see why I'm so impressed. We also had last week a discussion about a tub of dates that a fellow, this is actually a fellow, he's a shliach somewhere in Germany, and he'd bought a tub of Israeli dates and he wanted to give it to a non-Jewish acquaintance. And the issue is that Meiser hasn't been taken, and are you allowed to give when Trumas and Meisters haven't been taken off a produce? The term in Halacha is called tevel. So are you allowed to give tevel to a non-Jew? And the conclusion was that it's not allowed. So I'm just showing you from his email, and he says that this question of hanor shel kilui, when it's a benefit in a way that it's consumed. So he tells me that there's a Tosfos in Shabbos, and where it says that whether it's tevel toher or tevel tome, it's not allowed. Then there's a Tosfos in Brochus which says that you're not allowed to give a goy tevel, and he gives me a reference to the Atzir Levoina, which is a commentary on the margin of the Shulchan Aruch in Shin Lamed Aleph in Yeridea. He tells me exactly the page where it is, and he says that you're not allowed to give tevel to a non-Jew because there's no greater kilui than it being eaten by a non-Jew. At any rate, I'm not going to go in the lomdus. I just wanted to share with you, there's a German sitting out somewhere in Florida, and Knai Nahora, really, it's very impressive what he comes up and shares with us. Okay, let's go on to a practical thing. Someone asks a shaila that he needs to download a very large program, and it can take, those who are into it will know that sometimes it can many, many hours if it's a very big program. And so he's thinking, can he set this up in motion on Erev Shabbos, and then the downloading continues over Shabbos, and Motzei Shabbos, it's all done. Is that okay? And his worry was because of what he's seen in Hilchos Yom Kippur. So we're going to look at the Hilchos Yom Kippur, and then we'll look at Hilchos Shabbos. So on the right of your page, you have here, Simon Tov Reish Tes in Hilchos Yom Kippur. It says, some say you're not allowed to put, like normally for Shabbos, you're allowed to insulate hot water. They should have hot water for Shabbos. Some object to the hatmona, insulating of hot water, for on Erev Yom Kippur, to be ready for Motzei Yom Kippur, because the heter to do insulate hot food is for covered Shabbos. But here it's for Motzei Yom Kippur, that heter shouldn't apply. That's Then the second opinion says that v'yesh matirin, there are those who allow you to insulate hot food on Erev Yom Kippur to be ready, and because you're basically preparing on a weekday for a weekday, which is not a problem. Even though it's sitting on the stove over Yom Kippur, that's not called that Yom Kippur is preparing, because you're not doing anything physically on Yom Kippur. It's happening by itself. The halacha is like the latter svara, that you are allowed to, but the custom is to follow the stricter opinion and not to put up hot water on Erev Yom Kippur, to have hot water for Motzei Yom Kippur. On that basis, if you wouldn't be allowed to leave food to be warming over Yom Kippur for Motzei Yom Kippur, then what about this computer program being downloaded over Yom Kippur? So we'll see the halacha in the principle clearly why it's mutter, and then that would leave the question, why then on Yom Kippur is there the chumrah? Possibly because in addition to the happening of a malacha by itself, there's also the concern that you might come to there's always, anyone who's learned the Gemara Shabbos at the beginning, in the third period, talking all about worrying about Shem Yachati, you might come to adjust it, might come to stoke it, add some coals, etc. So keeping food warm may be more fraught, more worrying, and therefore it's only allowed for Shabbos and not for Motzei Yom Kippur. But just an automated job happening on Shabbos is not a problem, and this we see clearly in Siman Reish Nun Beis, and we have here Sif Aleph says you're allowed to start a malacha on Erev Shabbos, Somoch Lechashecha, close to nightfall, even though it won't be finished mib'ed yom, it won't be finished before Shabbos begins. V'hi nigmeres me'eleho b'Shabbos, it will continue to happen on Shabbos. Kagoin lishrois dioi v'samemonim b'mayim. For example, to put ink and other herbs into water, and it will have to soak, and then it will develop to an ink. Or he has another example, to put barley into a barrel, and it's going to be soaking the whole of Shabbos. Then he says another example of putting incense on the clothing, that they should be impregnated with the fragrance over Shabbos. And so it's very clear that even though it's going to go the whole Shabbos, it's still allowed. And that's the same thing over here. And so that's the Mishnah, which talks about water, poiskin mayim legino, that about diverting water to a garden, and this water is coming a whole Shabbos. I think today in Israel, using sprinklers on time switches, that's not so straightforward, possibly because of the coming to adjust things. But in principle, a automated process which is initiated before Shabbos isn't a problem. Let's move on to the next question. So over Shabbos, we had this discussion at home that there's a custom of people when they make hamotzi from a whole loaf, so they cut off a tip. What's the reason for this? So we've got here a couple of sources. One is the Sefer Mili de Chasidusa. Then we have from the Yaris Dvash and Sefer HaMinhogim. Now the Sefer HaMinhogim is, many of us are familiar with, and many of us received it as a bar mitzvah present possibly. Tam de yesh, that's the Rashi writing in the middle. Tam de yesh levorech al heicha de kodim bishula de pas hamotzi. Sorry, I'm misquoting it. What he's saying here is, why is it the mitzvah to make the bracha on the edge of the bread? Because that's where the chitzonim, they kind of gather there, and therefore one should make a bracha to counter the chitzonim. We're going to discuss this. He quotes the Yaris Dvash, and the upper two columns are from the Yaris Dvash. Yaris Dvash was written by Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz, who was a contemporary of the Baal Shem Tov. He was a Rav in Prague. So we're going to read his words in a moment. Let's just read the bottom two lines from the Sefer Mila de Chassidusa. And this is a commentary of the Bechotcher Rov, which I mentioned a few times about the Bechotcher Rov. He was a Talmud of the, he was Niskar of Chassidus by the Berditchever. So he writes Umash, and then he's got a commentary here on the Tzavos of Yehuda HaChossid. Tzavos of Yehuda HaChossid is lots of these Santa Segulus things, and he writes Umash noyagin sheloi lechel kol prusa da hamoitzi rak l'shayr me'at. Why is it customary not to eat the entire piece of hamoitzi, to leave a little bit? Gam kenochoin mitzad bechinas masha omar hakosuf. He quotes the pasuk. Ein sorid le'ochloi al kein lo yochil tuvoi. If he leaves nothing at all, that's not going to give him goodness and strength. That's the pasuk in Iyov. If he doesn't say, he's understood this pasuk to say, if you eat and you leave nothing at all, then that's asking for trouble. But by leaving a little bit, that's going to bring goodness. So that's the Bechotcher Rov. Now let's go to the Yaris Dvash and B'Hashgocha Protis. Just the other day, I think it was Sunday, I was listening to the El Yaakov Shir given by Rabbi Ephraim Potash in our shul, and he was learning this piece of Gemara in Sanhedrin. So I'm going to go through the Gemara in Sanhedrin. So that's on the first column, the second line. There's the Gemara Sanhedrin Daf Kuf Beis Amud Beis, and Rav Ashi, the last generation of the Gemara, he said to his Talmidim, tomorrow we're going to deal with liftach bechavrin. Tomorrow we're going to deal with our good friends, our colleagues, our mates. And what he meant was he was going to talk about those people who are listed as heretics, who are Evdei Avodah Zarah, and they've got no portion in Elam Haba, etc. That's the Chelik in the Sanhedrin. And particularly, he had in mind Menashe. Menashe was the son of Chizkiyahu Melech Yehuda, and he was very much into idol worship. And although there is an opinion that he did tshuva, but meanwhile, Rav Ashi spoke in a quite disparaging way. Tomorrow we'll kind of roll up our sleeves up, and we're going to deal with our good friends. Also, Menashe bechelmei. So Menashe Melech Yisrael, Melech Yehuda, comes that night to Rav Ashi in his dream. You call me your mate, you call me your father's friend. You know what you're talking about. You are Talmud Chochem. This is how Menashe is challenging Rav Ashi in his dream. In other words, he's saying, how you don't come to my ankles in Lomdus, and you're talking to me about you're my mate. And to challenge Rav Ashi, Menashe asks him in the dream, Mehechon bois lemeishra hamoitzi. When you have a loaf of bread, where do you make hamoitzi from? Where do you break off the piece for hamoitzi? And in his dream, Rav Ashi says, Omalei lo yadanu. And so he says, I don't know. I don't know which side of the loaf you're meant to break the bread, break off. And so Menashe says, aha, from where you're meant to break off when you say hamoitzi, that you don't know. And you're calling me, I'm your mate. You don't even know such a basic thing. And you're calling me that I'm your friend and your colleague. No, in the dream, so Rav Ashi says to Menashe, and he says, teach it to me. Teach me the halacha. Tomorrow I will give it over in the shir, and I will say our whole conversation, and I'll tell over the Talmidim. And so, okay, so Menashe in the dream he tells him, Amale mehecha de kodim bishula, from where it starts cooking, where the baking, where it bakes the first part, where it bakes, that's the part where the brocha should be. That when you make a brocha, that's where you should break off. No, and so this is the Gemara. Now the Rebbeinu Eibeshitz, the Aras Dvash, starts discussing this. What was this conversation? Are you my mate or my teacher? And what's it got to do with the Hamoitzi? The whole thing is Hadvorim Temuim Me'oid. And he says, what's going on here? And why is it significant where you break the bread off? So I'm just cut out a few pieces which are crucial to our discussion. So second column, top of the page. He says something that everything has got a certain degree of poison in it, and to get rid of that poison, that you need to have fire. And so it's the baking or the cooking of the food that gets rid of the poison in the food. Let's skip a bit. With this, you'll understand why we say hamoitzi on where it starts the baking. The part which bakes sooner. And then it doesn't. It's got less poison in it, less nochosh presence. And Amiel says, if there was some kind of poison in the food, it's run away from here sooner, and therefore it's deserving of a bracha. Because take a bihigorish or eres sitra de mesava, as soon as the evil is driven out, so then chal sitra de kedusha. That's when the kedusha has a chance to take hold. So the crust where the sitra achra was driven away sooner, therefore it has a greater presence of kedusha. And that's he explains why one should break a brocha on the edge. So all of this seems to be just the opposite of our whole discussion till now about cutting off the little tip. So the Tami HaMinhogim has explained in short why when we break off, so what that means in practically, if you have a slice of bread and you made brocha hamoit, you have an open piece of bread. Instead of breaking off from the soft area, you break off from the crust. That's what the halacha is which is said for this Gemara. And that's because we've been told that the heat of the oven is driving away the sitra achra and the nochosh, and so the part which is near the edge has got more bracha. But if that's the case, then becomes the question just the opposite. So why are we taking the tip of the bread and discarding it? And that seems to be an open question. I'm just going to suggest when we wake up in the morning, we wash Negelwasser. The reason why we wash Negelwasser and why it's called Negelwasser, which means washing the nails, water for the nails, is because when we are sleeping, so there's a ruach hatuma, there's a spirit of impurity, because there's a vacuum of kedusha, and where there's a vacuum of kedusha, that's where the tumah comes and resides. When we wake up in the morning, so then the kedusha kind of reoccupies the body, and then you have the tumah goes away. Where does it go away? It goes away through the nails, and that's why the nails kind of retain a bit of impurity, and that's the washing of the Negelwasser. Possibly, on the one hand, yes, the fire is kind of getting rid of the sitra achra, but the edge possibly may also be where the avenue where all the rest of the is going out, and perhaps that's why we are discarding the edge. At any rate, we do have, it's brought down in numerous forum, there is this minhag of a tiny little bit leaving, and it also reminds me in the story in the Medrash, in the introduction for Eicha, where it says about the chokhmah of the people of Yerushalayim, and where someone came as a guest and he finished every single last drop of the food. And the next day, the person, the host or hostess, put in a lot of salt, and then the person couldn't eat it. He says, well, if you wouldn't, well, they asked the hostess, why is he not eating it all? So he says, it's too salty. So, well, if you would have been a mensch and not finished the last drop yesterday, then you would have had plenty to eat today. So there seems to be some kind of edelkeit, some refinement of not having the very last bit. And that thing, I think, is what the Eshel Avram, or what the Bachotcherov is saying, that Ein sorid leochlo, you've eaten mamish, you haven't left a drop. That's not a good hanhoga. You eat and you leave a little bit over. I think that's what he's saying. Someone is putting on the chat a separate question. At a certain age, one wakes up a few times. Baruch Hashem. Does one say Moida Ani each time? I don't think so. My understanding is you only, even Negelwasser, is only when you get up to stay up properly. But if you're getting up just to deal with things that you can't do through a shliach and then go back to bed, I don't think you have to wash Negelwasser. And the same thing with Ani, you'd wait till you get up to stay up. Let's move on. Okay, so now I got a call on bank holiday. It was one of these, it was about 10:30, one of these late minyonim. And the question was, what's the minimum of people who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah to make up a minyan to be allowed to do Kriyas HaTorah? So there are various opinions about this. And what you have in front of you is a quote from the Mishnah Berurah, as you can see at Biur Halacha, where he quotes the Chayei Odom, who says, I'm not sure if there are people who haven't Kriyas HaTorah, whether if there are only a few people who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah, can you do Kriyas HaTorah for them, or do you need to have all 10 to make up a minyan to be able to do Kriyas HaTorah? And the Herani Godel Echad, says the Mishnah Berurah, that it's a ran in Megillah, in the Sugya, where it talks about Megillah Bismano, Koirim Beyochid, that when you Megillah, there's a very interesting halacha that it can be read a couple of days in advance, but that's only with a tzibur. Beyochid, it can be read only Bismano. So in that round, there's a comment just in passing where he says that if you have a roiv, that's okay. So the Mishnah Berurah is arguing with the Chayei Odom. Chayei Odom was suggesting that to be able to have a Kriyas HaTorah, you'd have to have 10 who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah. And the Mishnah Berurah says, no, so long as you have roiv, that's good enough. So that's the Mishnah Berurah, that you have to have roiv. Then there is this Mishnah Berurah is quoted by Reb Chaim Noah in Ksos HaShulchan, in Siman Chof Hei, and he says also, if you have 6 who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah. Now, having said that, there are those who say that even if you have 3 who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah, and there's one who says that even if all have heard Kriyas HaTorah, but if it's during davening, so because Kriyas HaTorah is part of the Seder HaTfilah, therefore you can do Kriyas HaTorah again. And that, to give you the exact quote, is a sefer called Toras Yukusiel. It's a Shalos Tshuvos, a relatively recent one from pre-war, but relatively recent. And in Siman Nun Aleph, he says this. Now, what I've seen, the general meaning which I've seen is that one would require 6, like the Mishnah Berurah, like the Ksos HaShulchan. And now the argument that because it's in Seder Kriyas HaTorah, it's because it's during davening, therefore they've got a special dispensation that you can do a Kriyas HaTorah even without the quorum of people who haven't heard. That's all very well. Perhaps people who would only do Kriyas HaTorah during davening. But I know that in Chabad, this is really not an issue. I remember the Gutta Zeiten in 770 would be at 8 o'clock, there'd be a minyan for Kriyas HaTorah, and there'd be minyanim before and after. People were not so particular to hear Kriyas HaTorah dafka during the Seder HaTfilah. And therefore, to say that Kriyas HaTorah is part of Seder HaTfilah, I think in Lubavitch we see it as a standalone, and therefore I don't see that as a redeeming factor. However, there is another piece which I'd like to think about more, and I see it is brought in the discussion here. There is a note in Sefer HaMinhagim about how many people you need for on a fast day to be able to do Kriyas HaTorah. How many fasters? Is that an English word? How many fasters or how many people fasting do you need to be able to do Kriyas HaTorah on a fast day? And there's a quote there from the Tzemach Tzedek, and he says, if there's 3 fasting. Now, this letter of the Tzemach Tzedek was written to his son, Reb Yisrael Noach Marin, who was the Rav in Yezhin, and it was a time when there was an epidemic there of cholera. And the Tzemach Tzedek, the father, tells his son, I'm instructing you, you mustn't fast, etc., because it looks like people were more vulnerable to the plague if they were undernourished. In that context, the Tzemach Tzedek says, if there's, as far as Lein Vayachal, he says, if there's 3 who are fasting, ve'al kol ponim oid shiva she'ochlu pochos mikashir, that there's 7 who have eaten less than a shear. So I'm not sure whether, so someone to say, you see, by a fast day, so long as 3 are fasting, that's good enough. But possibly the fact that the others are also fasting to a degree, they've eaten pochos mikashir, that may also make all the difference. But as I say, the general custom which I've seen is that one would be looking for 6 people who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah, regardless whether it's during a minyan or not. Although, as I say, there are those who are more lenient on that. Someone's asking here again on the chat, what if I wake up at night and want to have a drink of water and go back to sleep? What should I do? Moida ani negelwasser. I still don't think you have to say Moida ani, but in order to make a bracha, l'chayr, you have to wash your hands. If not negelwasser, but you should wash your hands a little bit before saying a bracha. The same thing, of course, if you go to the toilet in the middle of the night, so of course you have to wash your hands, not necessarily negelwasser, but at least you'll wash your hands to be able to, because you've touched mekomas and mechusim, etc. So you'd have to wash your hands before saying the bracha shiyotza. Let's move on. Okay, so I got an email at the beginning of the week about saying that someone writes to me, he heard in the name of my shver, Nachman Sudak alav shalom, that it's a appropriate thing to say Yizker for the Rebbe. And the person he says, in person, he'd never heard it from anywhere else. And he was of 2 minds, whether to say whether it is appropriate or not. It's something there are words in the Yizker which are saying that they should have an easy restful time. And perhaps a Chassid doesn't feel that way to the Rebbe. That's why I'm reading into his question. At any rate, but yes, this is a quote from the Rebbe, from a Sikha, and this is in Toras Menachem, volume Memvov, page 343, and the Rebbe says the following, that saying Yizker is also appropriate for such neshamis which don't need an atonement. Ki yadua minhag chasidim lahazkir. It's known the minhag of Chassidim to mention the Frierdiker Rebbe, his father-in-law, and also the previous Rabbeim, those who the Rebbes who you were familiar with, who you met. It would be appropriate to say Yizker. Kach, and he says the following. So the Rebbe doesn't need your Yizker. He's doing fine. Kach shezeu inyan shepolose hi avur ha'omer. The benefit is for the one who's saying Yizker. Es tut oif for them was zoktes. Saying Yizker is a benefit for the sayer of Yizker. So that's the first point which the Rebbe is saying here. Then the Rebbe adds, Avul be'achreiach loimar, she'inyan zeh noisten koyach gam avur eilu she'oiso maskidim benusar amiras Yizker. Saying Yizker is a benefit for the Chassid. Be'hechrich, I must say it also is adding energy for the one for whom you're saying Yizker. So you're giving koyach to the Rebbe by saying Yizker. And what is Yizker? Yizker is, of course, short tefillah. It's also giving tzedakah, crucial to the Yizkir is the Bavushin, Nodav or no, whatever the Loshen is, Bli Neder, but to give tzedakah Le'ilu Nishbas in memory, in the merit of the one whom you're saying Yizkir for, and that's very, very important to remember to pay your Yizkir money right after Yom Tov. I see you're saying, someone is pointing out that Rabbi Schneeberg Olav Shalom said in davening it's enough to have 3 Taleim. So all right, so he's relying on the Torah Yukasil. That's not the minig which I've seen in Chabad. So, and I think that knowing the Alter Rebbe's shitta in Siddur to be machmir me'oid b'sofek bracha and filo b'svek sveke, so in Chabad there's perhaps a greater perhaps the word anxiety may be a strong word, but there's a greater concern on not saying a bracha where there might be a bracha l'batala. Okay, now I want to just share with you now about a bit more about Yizkir, and that is, first of all, that in many communities, and this I've seen in Sforim, that they would at Yizkir they would say Yizkir for the previous Rabbanim. So, and people would say Yizkir for their Rebbes. This seems to be a very common thing. You see in other Sforim, people would say Yizkir for Rebbes and Rabbanim whom they owe. Okay, now what I'm showing you here now is someone asked me this morning. He saw the agenda for today's shir, and he asked if I could address about saying Yizkir for other relatives, not for a parent. So primarily Yizkir is for father and mother. That's the primary Yizkir. But you take a look in other Sidurim, there's many more examples of Yizkir. Now, on the left of your screen, this is a copy from the Siddur Seder HaAvodah, which was published in Vilna 110 years ago. Around 1944, when the Merkaz Le'Nyonei Chinuch had set up schools in America, and they needed to have a nice, attractive siddur, an easy siddur, and the Torah Or siddur was not suitable. It's good for Talmidei Chachomim who know how to flip the pages back and forth. Then the Rastova siddur is good if you have a magnifying glass. So then they needed to have a good siddur and pleasant to read, and they chose, at the time, this siddur, Seder HaAvodah, which is, as I say, was printed in Vilna. It's a beautiful, the graphics are very nicely done. It's a siddur of Nusach HaRizal, but it was modified according to our, in other words, they were printed Nusach HaRizal, but there were things which needed to be modified. So what you're seeing here is, on the left of your screen, it says here about saying a Yizkir for other relatives, his grandparents and uncles and aunts and brothers and sisters, etc., and saying Yizkir for them. And the first Yizkir, in other words, the second Yizkir on which you see on the page, is talking about the ones who had passed away in a natural form, and the last Yizkir on the page is those who had been killed, murdered, etc. Al Kiddush Hashem. So we've got these Yizkars which were there in that siddur, and when Chabad printed over that very same siddur, so those pieces were taken out, which just tells me that in Chabad, Yizkar is primarily for Oviv Ve'imoy. And as I said, Rabbi also, which you'd put in the Rebbe's name when you'd say Yizkar for the Rebbe. Before going further, you also see the Keil Moli Rachamim, which was said in that minhag, and it's in the general minhag, they do say Keil Moli Rachamim. Is that right, Reb Mendel? Saying that Keil Moli Rachamim is part of the Yizkar process, procedure, whatever, and then the Mishabeirach, after which Alva Rachamim. In the Kahos Siddur, those are taken out. What I would say is the following. If there is a relative who didn't leave any children, who would say, or there's no one else saying Yizkar for them, then I think it would be appropriate to say Yizkar for them. Whereas if it's a a relative who did leave children, and so then it'd be less of a need to that's called for to be saying Yizkor for them. Now, the in now I'm comparing. I didn't put on the screen. By Yizkor in the Torah Ursid, it has just for Oviv Imoy. It has just those two Yizkors. Doesn't have the rest, as I just mentioned. And then about Ovarachamim. So Rabbi Grono Olav Shomim asked the Rebbe once, does someone who has parents say Ovarachamim? And the Rebbe kind of affirmed that yes. Now this is very interesting. The Ovarachamim, which appears here, is not in the Siddur Torah. So if you're using Torah Siddur, you don't know about saying Ovarachamim, and certainly if you didn't say Yizkor, you wouldn't know about it. When Kahos printed the Siddur, they included Ovarachamim, as I said, Ovarachamim is said even the children who go out, the people who go out, people who have parents, and they go out, should still be saying Ovarachamim at the time of Yizkor. Let's now just take a look at some of the questions which have come in. Someone is asking, related to last week, why would you want to wear apostle talis, covered hatzibur? Surely there's no mitzvah from last week. On Shabbos you're on onus, you can't make knots for tzitzis. So listen, this is a written. You can take a look this halacha in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Yud Gimel, where it says if a person is embarrassed, it could be there's a person is embarrassed, and the only talis available is apostle talis, as it says in Shulchan Aruch, he's allowed to put it on. That's the halacha, because he can't do the mitzvah of putting the tzitzis. So someone's asking people that go out, would they say Yizkor for the Rebbe? I don't think so. I think it's once you're Dir Tzalang Yor, you shouldn't never need to say Yizkor, Reb Zalman, but people who are already saying Yizkor will say Yizkor for the Rebbe. That's probably the reason why the Bochrim are not so familiar with this, because Baruch Hashem, most Bochrim don't say Yizkor. Someone's asking, what if the deceased has children, but you don't know that they're saying Yizkor? Okay, all right. So there's no harm in saying Yizkor. I'm just saying as a standard thing, it's not a standard thing. Someone's asking, doesn't it say that Ovarachamim is optional? Yeah, but it seems to be recommended. Someone's asking if a spouse is unable to say Yizkor, can the other spouse say Yizkor on his or her behalf? Don't need to, because someone is saying Yizkor in any case. But if she's asking you to do it, or if you think it's going to give her nachas ruach, there's no harm in saying another Yizkor. Someone's asking, does Yizkor have to be said in shul? And the answer is, you mustn't tell this to the honorary officers of the United Synagogue, but Yizkor can be said at home also. It doesn't need a minyan, and Baruch Hashem, there are many minyanim where most of the minyan go out, and there's only a handful of people who say Yizkor. Yizkor doesn't need to have a minyan, but in the greater shuls, in the big synagogues, the Yizkor is a very big court, and there's a whole seder, so people don't want to miss out. Yeah, someone say you have to be in a shul to be able to go out for Yizkor. Very good. Let's move on to a question which someone asked me this week. He's quite very active in Mivtzah Tefillin, and he had put down the Tefillin on the table or whatever, and as he was walking around the room, he tripped over the strap of the Tefillin, and it fell on the floor. So now in Shulchan Aruch, this is the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch in Siman Mem Dalet for the Mogen Avraham there. It's a custom to fast if the tefillin fell to the ground. If tefillin fell to the ground without a cover, it's customary to fast. And then he talks about the Sefer Torah, which we're not going to discuss now. But talks about it fast. And now the person asks, is there a difference between tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel rosh? So, yeah, the Eibishter helped. There is I have a sefer called Shulchan Melochim. In that, there's a section called Halacha LaMoshe. He there quotes a sefer called Torah Tov Ches, which I understood to be Torah's Chaim, who says there's a difference between Shel Yad and Shel Rosh. Others disagree, and I looked up the Torah's Chaim. I couldn't even find it there, and I don't see absolutely any svara I don't see any difference whether it's a Sheyad or Shel Rosh. It's the same parashas inside. And so, although this has got a shin, this doesn't have a shin, but there doesn't seem to be any mention here about a difference between Shel Yad and Shel Rosh. So, l'chayre, one would have to fast. But then, to mitigate things, so here we have a tshuva from Rav Wozner, Zechon Levracha, and Shevet Halevi, where he talks about sometimes a sofer. It's all very well, a person who wears tefillin only by davening, and then he puts them away in his locker or whatever and goes to work. But a sofer is working a whole day with tefillin, and inevitably sometimes an accident will happen at work. Does he have to fast? Or can he be poider? So Rav Wozner said, Lefi Aniyas Daiti Poshut, that which it has the chumretz in Siman Mem, and Alter Rebbe Siman Mem Dal, it doesn't matter, that there's an union of fasting if tefillin fall without a cover. That doesn't apply to a sofer who is working with tefillin and they fell in the process of his work. Although, of course, he should be careful. For sure, for a sofer, pidyon to redeem the fast, that would be enough. And he says the pidyon would be the amount it would cost for a day's, the food for a day. So I feel that we can certainly extend the heter, or the lenient ruling of the Rav Wozner also to a person who's active mitzvah tefillin, and therefore to say that yes, in principle there should be fasting, but you could be paid to the fast by giving an amount for tzedakah. How much does it cost for food for a day? Well, it depends, but probably about £5 would be for many people would be more than how much their food for a day costs. Let's move on. Now, we're reaching, it's near Shavuos, and I'm getting lots of shilas about people want to bring Sifrei Torah for making for Aseres Hadibris, that children should hear Aseres Hadibris. I want to make a little plug. I put out a sefer in Nesivim B'stei HaShlichus, volume 3, and it has there a chapter on the Aseres Hadibris, and it's got 10 paragraphs. So my joke is it's Aseres Hadibris about Aseres Hadibris. And so talking about the various shilas which come up. So someone suggested, he said he'd read in a sefer, that if the Sefer Torah is inside an Oren, then it's okay to transport it. Bichlal, we're very, very, the word cagey is the right word, but very anxious about moving a Sefer Torah in the public. It's something in which anyone who's read the Zohar and towards the end of the Minor Loshen, it's a strong apprehension not to carry a Sefer Torah freely. People should come to the Sefer Torah rather than taking the Sefer Torah to them. That's the general principle. And so people have asked me about taking a Sefer Torah to a park. I felt to carry a Sefer Torah through the street on Yom Tov, even with a cover, it doesn't seem right. Bring a Sefer Torah, bring people to the Sefer Torah. Even if you have a grounds, take it out to the garden of a house is one thing, but to take it out to a public park, marching through the street, I felt uncomfortable about this. But meanwhile, here we have, so someone had come up with this idea that if the Sefer Torah is in an Oren, it's okay to move it around freely. So the Eibishter helped. That I couldn't find that heter, but here's a interesting tshuva from Igros Moshe. It's Chelik Yeridea, volume 2, number Siman Tzadik Aleph. And here's a story about a kehillah who have a hall and they want to multi-purpose hall. So what they want to do is to have a mechanism that when they want to use their hall for other things, so then the Sefer Torah, the whole Oren Kodesh, will go down into a pit, be lowered down by pressing a button, and the Oren Kodesh will be out of the way, and then they'll have an open dance floor v'chulu. And so Reb Moshe says, also he says, even for Kriyas HaTorah, we are very concerned about schlepping a Sefer Torah to a house. Talks about in Shulchan Aruch about bringing it to a prison, that a person should hear Kriyas HaTorah. So we're very concerned about this. And then in line of Reb Moshe, or Poshut Sha'af im ha'oren osel lahavi. It goes out of it's Poshut, that no difference schlepping a Sefer Torah alone or schlepping with the Oren. I think where the person was coming from was a mistake. There is a thing when you bring a Sefer Torah to another place, if there is an Oren Kodesh in the second place, then there's an honorable place to put it. That allows you more to bring the Sefer Torah to a second location, if there's an Oren Kodesh there. But carting an Oren Kodesh through the street doesn't take away from the question of schlepping around the Sefer Torah. And for sure, in this case, because they want to have a bigger dance floor, Moshe doesn't go along with that at all. Okay, let's go to our last thing on our list, and that is about the snap tzitzis. Now, I was wondered before talking about the snap tzitzis, I see the garment which we have here is made of some kind of, it's not a cotton, it's some kind of nylon, it looks like, a bit of breathable nylon. I'm not so sure how muhuder it is. Bichal Chassidim are particular to wear a woolen talis cotton, and well, this is not Lubavitcher tzitzis in any case, the way it's been put on, yeah? But the tzitzis are made up of two main parts. You've got the part which is tightly wound, and that is called gedil. And then we've got the part which is the loose strings, and that's called pesil. So you've got two parts. Now, there is a halacha in Gemara that if the threads of the tzitzis snap, if it's left kedei anivo, enough, if the thread has got a little bit enough to be able to make a loop, then if it's a minority of the threads, then the tzitzis is still kosher. Now, the question is does that shiur kedei anivo, is that meaning referring to the loose threads beyond the last knot, or is that true even inside the gedil, the braided part of the tzitzit? So let's read this in Shulchan Aruch. This is Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch Siman Yud Beis Sivov. When we have a din of kedei anivo, that in order for the tzitzis to be still kosher, there must be left remaining the amount to be able to make a loop. Yesh oimrim. There are those who say kol hagedil sholim. The braided part has to be completely intact. Min ha'onof, and from the part which is branching out, the loose threads, that's where there should be a kedei aniva. There needs to be 3 centimeters, whatever the shear is. Yesh oimrim, and there are those who say no. Even if nifsuku b'mokem shehem kruchim begedil, even if it's snapped inside the braided part, v'lo nishtar bohem mimokem shenifsuku ad mokem sheyotzim min hakonof dahainu haschol sagdil ela kedei aniva kosher. I'm not sure how you read that, translate it exactly. He's suggesting that if you have kedei aniva, even inside the braid is also okay. The general minig is to require kedei aniva beyond the last knot. In other words, the branching out loose threads, that's where you have to have kedei aniva, and therefore, if it snaps inside the braided area, as you can see on the picture, that would not be okay. I want to share with you, just recently, as I was walking through shul, my tzitzis got caught in, my tzitzis of my talus, got caught in the tubular frame of a chair, and the thread, you know, the Chabad talus, you got an extra string, an extra little hole where the shamas goes through before it goes braiding around the whole tzitzis. So it got snapped over there. So I had to undo that tzitzis and redo it again. So that, and this is the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch brings both opinions. In the Siddur he says the same halachas, but there is very clear that if it's snapped, if there's a tzitzis snapped within the braided area, then that tzitzis is not valid, and you're going to have to replace them before using it. Okay, that's it for tonight, and I wish you all a guten Shabbos, and we should hear besuras tovas from one another. Tomit kol hayomim.